always a treat, always a pleasure for me to hop back on my podcast and discuss combat sports. Combat sports meaning MMA, boxing, you name it. There's a lot to discuss in the wide world of MMA and boxing. I'm Ryan Thomas, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in once again to my show, the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Typically, of course, as you see behind me each and every week, Buffalo Bills content on the show, but I also cover combat sports, MMA, boxing, and there is a ton to discuss. It is long overdue that I hop on here and provide you guys with combat sports coverage. We have a lot of big fights coming up. We have a lot of interesting storylines coming up that have obviously materialized over the course of, shall I say, the last 3-4 days. So let's get right to it. This is a live show. You can hear it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. And I say that for the audio listeners. This show has a great audio audience, and I take pride in that. I like that portion of the show. So you will see my UFC 269 prediction. You will hear my thoughts on that big fight card coming up December 11th in this show. We got 3 more days before Charles Oliveira looks to defend his title against Dustin Poirier for the UFC lightweight title. Poirier obviously coming off of 2 straight wins over Conor McGregor, and his stock has never been higher. I don't think there's any fighter that has stock as high as Poirier's right now. But I'd like to start the show off. The Combat Sports Show, featuring yours truly, Ryan Thomas, Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Tonight's Combat Sports Show. I'd like to start it off with Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley Part 2. Yes, Jake Paul is now fighting Tyron Woodley when Jake Paul was originally supposed to be fighting Tommy Fury. And let me tell you, wow, this is interesting, is, I think, appropriate. And yeah, a lot of the people that tune into this show that know my thoughts on Jake Paul and the whole Jake Paul boxing experiment are going to be shocked by the fact that I am coming at the show with this take. That, yeah, I'm very curious as to see how Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley 2 materializes, how that fight, goes down. Obviously, it's a fight that the first fight I thought was very entertaining, was a solid fight between a guy that's not a boxer and a former UFC world title holder, welterweight champ. So I was very curious to see how or when or if the rematch would even happen. Jake Paul wasn't interested in the rematch. He wanted Tyron Woodley to get the tattoo. There was some hesitation on Woodley's part to get the tattoo, but Woodley ended up getting the tattoo. And then the rematch still didn't happen, regardless of whether or not Woodley got the tattoo. And now, due to unforeseen circumstances of Jake Paul versus Tommy Fury falling apart and not happening, we now have Tyron Woodley swooping in on 12 days notice to take this fight with Jake Paul. Now, to give you the proper news cycle, this fight was supposed to happen between Tommy Fury and Jake Paul on December 18th. Now, Tyron Woodley stepping in there for Tommy Fury on December 18th. And we heard that news on Monday, this past Monday, but Jake Paul knew that news on Friday. So we had a weekend of probably verifying whether Woodley was up to snuff as far as a physical and getting everything kind of scanned and checked out, making sure that he was ready, getting the numbers right, of course, in the contract, because that's always the most important thing when we're talking about a bout agreement, right? How much is the spread for Woodley? How much is the spread for Jake Paul? Does Jake Paul's spread go down? Does it change? Or, what are the numbers, right? And it's safe to say the numbers are high for Woodley taking this fight, whether it's on short notice or not. The numbers were high for Woodley in the first fight. Numbers are high for, Jake Paul. He's the A side because Jake Paul has the W over Tyron Woodley. But that W was a split decision victory. That W was a close fight. So anytime you have a close fight, you want to see it again. Anytime you have a close fight, and we want to see it again, and it wasn't given to us. That's a tough pill to swallow, and it wasn't given to us, but to get it back in any way, shape, or form due to Tommy Fury deciding that, hey, I'm going to pull out because I have X, Y, and Z. We don't exactly know the logistics as to why Tommy Fury pulled out of this fight. There's been rumors about an injury. There's been rumors about his mom being sick. There's been a lot of things, but I honestly could tell you that no matter what's true, no matter what's false, Tommy Fury pulling out of this fight is a bad look for Tommy Fury as well as the Fury family. Keep in mind, for those of you that don't know, Tommy Fury is the little brother of Tyson Fury, who is the champ right now, the world heavyweight champion. So he owns the majority of the belts in boxing at the heavyweight division. So, the fact that Tommy Fury pulled out of this fight, that doesn't make him look good. The fact that we now get Jake Paul and Tyron Woodley, the fact that Tyron Woodley took this fight on short notice makes Tyron Woodley look great. The fact that Jake Paul took this fight on short notice is a massive risk for Jake Paul. Regardless of my opinion on Jake Paul, I'm not a Jake Paul fan, but I do respect anyone that wants to step in there, let alone anybody that wants to step in there with anybody else on short notice that is a complete contrast and opponent from who he was training for. Tommy Fury and Tyron Woodley are two very different athletes in the ring or in the octagon in the case of Woodley's days as a UFC welterweight champ, but striking wise, they're two very different fighters. So for Jake Paul, I do give him credit, and I will say that this is an interesting fight because how much has Woodley been training, and how much has Woodley gone back to the well and looked at that first fight and said, man, I just didn't pull the trigger. I just couldn't pull the trigger for whatever reason. I wasn't able to land my punches, wasn't able to land what I wanted to land. And I think that is something that was eating at Tyron Woodley, and I think that that's something that we have to acknowledge in Tyron Woodley that he wanted this fight, he's getting the opportunity, and credit to him, and credit to Jake Paul for taking the fight and keeping the event alive, as it's one that obviously Amanda Serrano is a co-main, and you got Frank Gore and Darren Williams. Frank Gore was originally offered to fight Chael Sonnen. Chael Sonnen declined to fight. Chael Sonnen's been retired for quite some time with no interest in coming back. So it's obviously a freak show event. Jake Paul's at the top of it. Jake Paul's not a pro anything. He's trying to become a legitimate boxer. I think the jury is still out on that. I'm one of them that is still a little bit pessimistic towards Paul's career, so to speak, as a boxer, but he does own a win over Tyron Woodley. And whether it's a split decision win or not, it was the most impressive, quote unquote, win of his career. So I'm looking forward to this one, actually, in 10 days. I think that this is going to be a fun one, an interesting rematch. It allows Paul to get the opportunity to cinch himself a nice payday, as well as Woodley. It allows Woodley to get the opportunity to get a nice payday as well. So credit to him. So wanted to start the show off with that, kind of a little bit of a different discussion there. Not to say that I'm Jake Paul's biggest fan, but I do give him props for taking this fight on short notice, as well as Woodley, for the sake of saving this event, for the sake of providing a rematch that I think is well-deserved for both guys. All right, so here we go. My UFC 269 prediction segment of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Combat Sports Show. I'm covering all things MMA, boxing in this show. UFC 269 is this Saturday. It snuck up on us. It's the final pay-per-view of the year for the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and you have a main event that is very intriguing, very entertaining, and Charles Oliveira and Dustin Poirier. It's for the UFC lightweight title. Co-main event, you get the women's bantamweight champion, the champ herself, Amanda Nunes, who is a champion of the women's bantamweight division, as well as the women's featherweight division. She's taking on Juliana Pena. You got Jeff Neal versus Santiago Ponzinibbio. And you have the UFC flyweight debut a former UFC bantamweight champion, Cody Garbrandt, taking on Kai Kara France, a fighter that I've always enjoyed watching. And then you have Julian Pavia taking on Sugar Sean O'Malley, who has been a star for the UFC in his early career here. He's definitely become an attraction. He's been a fighter that has generated a rub in the business, as they say, a buzz in the business, and has been given a rub by the company known as the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC. Preliminary card. You have Augusto Sakai versus Tai Tuivasa in the heavyweight division. You have former UFC bantamweight champion Dominic Cruz taking on Pedro Munoz. And then in the featherweight weight class, you have Josh Emmett, taking on Dan Ige. And these are good fights, man. These are really solid fights on the final event. I really like the prelims where you have Tai Tuivasa, Dominic Cruz versus Pedro Munoz, Josh Emmett versus Dan Ige. Those are fighters that everybody should know. Those fighters. If you don't, you're obviously a little bit behind. But the main card is really what stands out. All 5 fights, are big fights. Jeff Neal, he's had a little bit of trouble these last few weeks. There was a report on him that he had some trouble with the law. Hopefully he's okay, and those that were involved are okay, and hopefully we see him fight. It's never good news to see that leading up to a fight. But Santiago Ponzinibbio is a tough competitor at welterweight, so that makes that one very exciting. So let's get to the main event. That's the fight that I really want to talk about. It is Charles Oliveira versus Dustin Poirier, and I don't know why I wrote 2, because it's not 2. It is Charles Oliveira and Dustin Poirier 1. So for those of you that saw that graphic, I'm going to put up the right graphic for the main event. Charles Oliveira versus Dustin Poirier. This is a fight I've been looking forward to since McGregor's loss, quote-unquote trilogy loss to Dustin Poirier. And regardless of whether you think that trilogy is over or that trilogy is an actual trilogy based on the method in which Poirier won that third fight, I don't think it's over between Poirier and McGregor. I know it's not over. I know the business of mixed martial arts. I know that fight sold a lot of pay-per-views, the second one and the third one. So I think down the line we will see that happen for the 4th time. 4 times they'll fight. I know they will. Whether Dustin Poirier wins this fight or not, there's a lot of scenarios at play here that could come to fruition, whether Poirier wins this fight or loses this fight. But if Poirier wins this fight, I think McGregor will be fast-tracked to a title shot, as ridiculous as that may be. The UFC is a business. They've proven it time and time again. They will put the fight on that sells the most pay-per-views. And Conor McGregor does that. Plain and simple. Better than anybody. So that's another part of the discussion. But when looking at Poirier right now, there are few fighters in the sport that are as dominant or that are as on fire, I should say, as Dustin Poirier is right now in the UFC. There are a few fighters that are in the prime of their career the way that Dustin Poirier is. You see a man enter the UFC lightweight division as a featherweight, and ever since he has changed the composition of his body and moving from 145 to 155. Dustin Poirier is a big 155-pound fighter. He could probably fight at welterweight. Realistically, he probably could fight at welterweight. I've watched him fight Dan Hooker. I've watched him fight Justin Gaethje. I've watched him fight Conor McGregor. I've watched him compete against the best of the best over the course of his entire career, and he's always typically the bigger guy. And I think this might be the first time where Poirier has the bigger upper body. He's got a wide back. He's super strong in terms of on the feet and on the ground. He can do a lot of damage on the ground if he has top position. He's not exactly known as a grappler. He's definitely a brawler, a striker, and a very good one. But Charles Oliveira is height-wise and length-wise a dynamic talent. And I think that that's something that Poirier hasn't really experienced in quite some time. If this fight goes to the ground, it's no secret that Charles Oliveira is going to find a way to end this fight quick if this fight goes to the ground. If it doesn't go to the ground, I think that this fight could be tough sledding for both men in the first 2 rounds, and then I see Poirier getting it done probably in the fourth, maybe even the third round. I don't see this one becoming like an all-out rock'em sock'em robot war between Charles Oliveira and Dustin Poirier. I see it more being a chess match the first 2 rounds. Maybe Oliveira gets a submission in round 3 if he does get the victory. And in the case of Poirier, if he gets the victory, maybe a TKO in the third or a TKO in the fourth. That's just how I envision the fight. I don't see this fight going the distance. If this fight goes the distance, I think Charles Oliveira is going to suffer a ton of damage over a 25-minute span. It's not the fight that Charles Oliveira wants to fight. That's not the fight for Charles Oliveira. You go back to Oliveira's performance against Michael Chandler. He was this close to losing that fight in the first round, he was just that close, to not winning ultimately the title in that fight with Chandler, winning the UFC lightweight title. So this is a very tough fight to call. It's just right now, I think that there is a moment in time where a fighter reaches the precipice of their career and they're at their peak. And Dustin Poirier has been peaking over the course of the last year. And I just have a very tough time going against him. I think Poirier does have a much weaker ground game, especially in comparison to Charles Oliveira. If you put Poirier in there with Conor, I'd probably give Poirier a ground game advantage over Conor. But putting Poirier in there with, let's just say, Khabib, that didn't exactly work out too well on the ground. Putting Poirier in there with Oliveira, I think it'll be even worse. Charles Oliveira leads the UFC in submissions, submission finishes, of course, and submission attempts in the modern UFC era. So I think that this is going to be one of those fights where Oliveira is going to try to stick and move, land his shots. If at some point the fight goes to the ground, he can get it done. He can finish it. Poirier, at all costs, to me, has to avoid the ground game completely, has to go after Charles Oliveira early and often and try to put as much damage on Oliveira as possible. Make this a slugfest. I know Poirier probably doesn't have much longer in his career to compete. He's done a lot in this sport. He's made his money, but he's probably got, what I'm trying to say in saying that is that he's got very few, battles left in there as far as rock'em sock'em, bloodthirsty wars. I think those days are coming to an end, but this is the one that he's got. If there was ever a time to bite down on the mouthpiece and get it done and really create a war in the octagon, this is the time. UFC lightweight championship on the line. Dustin Poirier climbed the ladder once again and made it happen. So you also have a fight at UFC 269 that I think is kind of flying under the radar, and it's flying under the radar due in large part to the fact that the woman competing in this fight is the champion of 2 weight classes. She is the greatest female fighter of all time in any era, in any version of fighting, whether it's boxing or mixed martial arts. Holly Holm was just inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, and now you have Amanda Nunes, who knocked out Holly Holm, still doing her thing as the UFC bantamweight as well as UFC featherweight women's champion. And Amanda Nunes versus Juliana Pena, the co-main event for UFC 269. I am very pumped for this fight, and I think this fight is legitimately a lot closer on paper than most people think. I do think Amanda Nunes will get it done. It's just a matter of how and when. But Juliana Pena, she appears as if she is just very, very focused. And I think that she should be taken very seriously. I hope Amanda Nunes and her camp have taken Juliana very seriously over the course of, the last X amount of months that they've been training for Juliana. She's a tough fighter. She's a very durable fighter. She's well-rounded. She's a great wrestler. She's great at avoiding and attacking the submissions. She's got great top pressure. She can land a ton of punches from top position, very hard. She can land great shots from bottom position, which is pretty rare to see as well. Juliana Pena, she has gotten a crack at Valentina Shevchenko. That didn't go so well for us. This is her second fight against one of the upper echelon women's fighters. When Juliana's fought that upper echelon, she has struggled, but I do believe in manifesting your own destiny, and it appears as if Juliana Pena has manifested this opportunity against Amanda Nunes, and I think that she will come to fight. I'm predicting a fourth round TKO knockout in what is a very close fight between Amanda Nunes and Juliana Pena. I think that Juliana is actually ready, willing, and able for anything to happen in this fight. I couldn't say the same thing about previous opponents with Amanda Nunes. So quick picks here. I'm going to do a quick pick segment here for UFC 269. And this is my prediction, quick picks. So quick picks, we got Jeff Neal versus Santiago Ponzinibbio. I'm going to go with Jeff Neal on that one if that fight takes place. I mentioned from the top, Jeff Neal has had some trouble with the law. I don't know if this fight is leaning towards being off the table, maybe, maybe not, but I'm just going to pick it anyway. Jeff Neal, I'm going with him getting the W. Kai Kara-France versus Cody Garbrandt. I love Kai Kara-France. I think he's a very tough fighter in the flyweight division. This is a very tough draw for Cody Garbrandt in his flyweight debut in the UFC, but I'm going to go with Garbrandt. I think he's going to be much bigger than Kai Kara-France, being that Garbrandt is a big bantamweight. Moving down from bantamweight to flyweight, I think we're going to see a unique skill set from Cody Garbrandt in this one, that Mark Henry has prepared him for this drop down from 35 to 25. Be very interesting to see what we see out of him. Julian Pavia versus Sean O'Malley. Sean O'Malley is a fun, entertaining fighter, but let's be real, he hasn't fought any upper echelon opponents, and Julian Pavia is not somebody that really jumps out at me. So I think due to the UFC's booking and matchmaking for Sean O'Malley, they're building him as the next big thing. They're slowly building him, and I think Julian Pavia is another example of that. I got Sean O'Malley winning via TKO. Preliminary card, I got Josh Emmett beating Dan Ige. I have Dominic Cruz beating Pedro Munoz. I have Tai Tuivasa beating Augusto Sakai. And another fight that I'm really excited for is Alex Perez versus Matt Schnell in the UFC flyweight division. That's on the early preliminary card. And I got Alex Perez getting that W. So 2 title fights on the night, Saturday night. Very pumped up for tonight, for Saturday night's card, I should say. And I wanted to cover it for you. That was the Thomas Take Sports Podcast Combat Sports Show. You can check it out on Facebook, YouTube as well, audio-wise, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. I'm Ryan Thomas. Keep punching.